Well, hello, it's us again. Welcome to the eighth edition of the ACSIS Exchange webinar series, a bold and necessary platform for confronting one of the most pressing and polarizing issues of our time: reparations and reparative justice. This dialogue situates African and Caribbean leadership at the heart of a global reckoning with historic and ongoing injustice and calls for decisive, unapologetic responses to structural inequalities that continue to shape our geopolitical and economic realities. As the world navigates the resurgence of Trump-era policies, such as renewed threats of immigration bans disproportionately targeting African and Caribbean peoples, and intensifying climate crises rooted in exploitative colonial legacies, the ACSIS platform challenges us to ask, what does justice look like in a world still unwilling to fully confront its past? This reparations session brings together global thinkers, life coaches, investors, and policymakers to examine the enduring impact of systemic harm, from racialized health disparities and exclusionary border regimes to the legacy of underinvestment in African and Caribbean public health infrastructure. These are not isolated issues. They are the aftershocks of slavery, colonization, and dispossession. At the crossroads of trade, climate, and equity, we ask, how can Africa and the Caribbean assert sovereignty, demand redress, and build sustainable, self-determined futures? What role does reparative justice play in reclaiming our health, our economies, and our voices? The world is watching. The time for transformative action is now. Be part of this conversation. My name is David Roberts. I'm the entrepreneur and publisher of the CaribDirect.com. I'm also the founder of the African Caribbean Sustainability and Investment Summit, and I'm also known for the blog CaribDirect.com. I have with me my deputy chair, Dr. Michelle Mosley, consultant coach, educator, a versatile financial consultant, educator, and life coach professional, experienced in advanced consultation strategies, investment advice, and retirement planning, and all aspects of life coaching. We also have with us our esteemed producer, Madison Tavares, dedicated to amplifying authentic Caribbean stories. Her storytelling expertise will help elevate ACSIS's global impact and foster greater inclusion in its narratives. Now, today, in terms of the focal points, we have three special guests, one of whom sits with me right now, and his name is John Dower. John is a film director and Trevelyan descendant. He uncovered his family's slave-owning past, co-led their public apology in Grenada, and now advances reparative justice through Heirs of Slavery and education narratives. We also expect the Reverend Dr. Critical Desir Truthbay, Continuum of Care policy analyst, champions advocacy and healing through homelessness prevention, employment, and policy reform, serving vulnerable populations across Los Angeles County with systemic change. And the last person who will grace us with their presence very shortly is Mr. Joseph Harker. Joseph is a senior editor at The Guardian, co-founder of the Legacies of Enslavement Project, and Driving Apology and 10 Million Plus Justice Plan. A media diversity leader, he champions accountability, representation, and restorative justice. So we should be launching directly into the discussions, but we may have to make a slight adjustment to the order, given that we have not seen Joseph yet. So I think we will revert to starting with John, So, John, I think this is your opportunity to shine. Over to you.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for introduction and hello to everybody. David, we were going to do a sort of question and answer. That was what we talked about. I don't know whether you want to ask those questions you've sent me, and it can sort of set us off into a conversation. Um, how do you want to do this? Would you
I
like
can
to?
I can certainly do that. What you might want to do while I field these questions, because the order has kind of put things in a bit of a
Mhm.
spin, is just tell us how you got into the idea of setting up the Heirs of Slavery, and that should give me a few minutes.
Sure. In 2016, I read an article written by David Olusoga, the eminent historian, in the Guardian newspaper, which encouraged any person that was descended from landed gentry, middle class, really, anyone who came from those kind of backgrounds, encouraged them to look into their family history in terms of their potential involvement with plantation ownership and involvement in transatlantic chattel enslavement. And I did that thinking, well, it's okay because our family, the Trevelyan family, has always been relatively radical in that my great grandfather was a Labour MP. I always had the impression that we were very public facing, philanthropic. We were on the side of the right guys, the right people, and also that our ancestors were very linked to the abolition movement. So I discovered, as soon as I went on the website, my life literally changed when I discovered that we had had involvement in 6 plantations in Grenada and received compensation in 1834 for the ownership of 1,004 enslaved people. That's how I got into this. I immediately felt that something needed to be done to redress the hypocrisy in my family as I saw it, because I felt that they hadn't been truthful with me. That sent me on the road to reparative justice in the form of persuading the rest of my family to get involved in apology. And 7 years later, I stood in front of a packed meeting with my cousin Laura Trevelyan and read out that family apology to the people of Grenada. 2 months later, we set up, me and Laura and several other descendants of the enslavers set up an organization called Heirs of Slavery, which we have been running since then. I can talk a little bit about Heirs of Slavery's aims, but maybe that just gives you a start off and a sort of personal motivation. I think it's fueled by the fact that I felt that my family had lied to me. I think that's really where my passion and my commitment to this cause comes from, because I felt that they had swept the skeletons under the carpet, literally, and therefore the hypocrisy, I couldn't deal with that. It was too big for me to just ignore.
Amazing, amazing. I could truly understand, what the motivation was. But what I'd like to do is to put you on pause so we can come back to you in accordance with the program, because we now have Joseph with us. So Joseph, welcome. Welcome
Hi.
to the eighth edition. And yes, if you can just give us an overview as to how it is you got the idea for setting up the legacies of enslavement, that would be really good, setting the tone.
Yeah. Hi, David. Hi, John. And sorry for a little bit late. I had a few technical issues here in the office, but yeah, good to be with you now. I know I've obviously worked with John quite a bit over the last couple of years, so we know our stories very well. So apologies, John, if you're going to have to hear this again. We at the Guardian, questions started being asked back in 2020, at the time that the Edward Colston statue being torn down in Bristol, when questions started to change from modern day racism to historic racism, and the relationship between the two, in that why do we still in our city centre still literally put people on a podium who've committed such brutal atrocities in the past. And we knew that the Guardian was founded in the city of Manchester, which had a very strong cotton trading history. And we also knew that the cotton came from the other side of the Atlantic and was created by enslaved people, was produced by enslaved people. So we knew that there was a possibility of a link between the Guardian's founder, John Edward Taylor, this is back in 1821, and slavery, but we just needed to know for sure. So we conducted some research and discovered, yes, there was a link, but not only did the founder have had the founder made money via transatlantic slavery, but also all of the people who funded him had made money through slavery as well, through cotton, and therefore, if in effect, through slavery. So it became quite a major project for us at that time to do something to acknowledge and do whatever we could to sort of to repair some of the damage. And so I was asked to sort of lead a restorative justice program and to draw it up, which we spent the next 2 years doing, 2 or 3 years, just talking to different people in this field, talking to reparations experts, as well as our own community, diaspora community in the UK and beyond, and within our own staff as well. And we drew up a 10-year, we ended up drawing up a 10-year program, which consists, roughly speaking, of journalistic projects to improve our journalism and certainly how we cover underreported parts of the world, such as Africa, the Caribbean, the United States, the UK, and South America, but also to provide journalistic opportunities for African descended people, and also to do more to increase public understanding of slavery and why its legacies are still with us. And that was partly with a major journalistic project known as Cotton Capital, but also in partnership with other institutions. We're working with the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester to do an exhibition on the role of enslaved people in creating the cotton, which created the city of, which created the wealth, which created the city of Manchester. So that's a major exhibition which is going to be launching in early 2027. And also we are doing direct restorative justice work with descendant communities in the areas where the Guardian founders made their money through slavery. One of those areas is, one of those regions is known as the Sea Islands off the coast of Southern Carolina, South Carolina and Georgia. And also one of the Guardian funders had a plantation in Jamaica in the parish of Hanover. And so we're doing more restorative justice work centering around descendant communities there. So that's kind of, in a way, that's the heart of the project, is the work that we're doing directly with descendant communities.
It's amazing, amazing stuff. And I'm very pleased to see that the Guardian had the presence of mind to actually, all the persons like yourself within the Guardian who had that vision to see how it is we can create that nexus between what had happened in over 400 years ago and today, and to make the effort to make amends. It's a really brave move.
If I can just sort of come in there, you say 400 years ago, which is one of the sort of barriers we have to engaging the public with why this issue matters. The slavery itself was, it was only abolished about 150 years ago. Business people from the city of Manchester were buying slavery-produced goods from South America right into the late 19th century. And not only that, when you think, one of the things that really hit me was visiting a slavery museum in Charleston in South Carolina, and they had a recording of someone who's born into slavery, and talking about his life in slavery. And that recording was made in the mid 1930s. And I remember thinking at the time, my mother was born in the mid 1930s. She's still alive. And so this history, which you think is like centuries and centuries, ancient history, it's actually not that long ago. It's literally 2 lifetimes ago.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but the legacies of slavery are still very much with us, not just in terms of the kind of the crude racism which we as Black people still face because of the stereotypes which were ingrained over those centuries of enslavement, but also just in terms of the wealth and the lack of wealth, and the lack of, although enslaved people were given their freedom in the 19th century, they had no wealth and no means to create wealth. So no property, no land. And so the inequalities which were embedded then at the end of slavery are still very much with us now. And you see in the massive wealth inequalities, the intergenerational inequalities that just have passed down from parent to child, and are still very much with us. So it's really important that part of that process of engaging the public, improving public understanding of this, is to show that it's a very real issue, very real today in many ways.
Yeah, you're quite right, and I'm glad that you picked up on my reference to 400 years, which is what many people seem to think is a convenient way to refer to, this thing that we call slavery in terms of our history. So what I'm really curious about is the truth telling and the healing bit. So how do you see the process of acknowledging Britain's role in slavery contributing to healing and reparative justice for Africa and the Caribbean?
When we visited Georgia in one of our visits just after we launched, it was just really clear that we spoke to the kind of a remarkable woman called Sister Pat Gunn, who leads tours of in Savannah in Georgia, about explaining to people the routes in which enslaved people were brought off boats, driven into the marketplace, and then sold in the marketplace. And again, this enduring legacy that around the marketplace there are about 8 banks, I think she told us, which were created during that era, are still there today and still making money. And they were founded off the proceeds of slavery and the profiting from slavery. And it just sort of struck me that there is this sort of running saw which she's battling with as a story which she's trying to tell, which people, for the most part, aren't willing to listen to, but which is so essential that we cannot. At the end, the Holocaust was a horrific thing at the Second World War, but at the end of that, there was a reckoning. There was the people who were committed it were punished. Many of them were hanged. There was a complete demolition of the whole ideology of Nazism. We never saw that with slavery. We saw a system which had embedded for 200 years or more, and which still, as I say, the inequalities still go on. The only people who got any reparations were the enslavers, which people conveniently forget. People like to think it was all because of William Wilberforce, and this moral argument was made which ended slavery, but it wasn't. That only ended the slave trade in 1807. Slavery was only ended when the enslavers were given a compensation of 20 million pounds, which is worth billions in today's money, 40% of the entire national budget, which was only paid off in 2015. So it's a really important that people understand how slavery endures, how the imagery, we see the brutality in terms of, the way that police treat Black people to this day. We had that awful case of Child Q a couple of years ago in a school in Hackney. That was a Black girl. You kind of know that would never happen to a white girl in a school, the way that she was so brutally treated and humiliated. So it was very clear to us that an apology was not enough. Some institutions have done this and apologized, and they think that's enough. It was very clear that we need to do more than that. We need to do something to sort of properly reduce the inequalities that have been so embedded in our society. We're only one institution. We're working with others. We're working with people like John and other institutions who are recognizing their historic role and the benefit that they have today because of those historic connections. But it's important that we actually do something to redress what is happening so that people can feel they can move on. Acknowledging that Britain has never apologized for its role in slavery. That's something that needs to be done. That never properly apologized. A small, very slight statement of regret is all that Prime Minister Tony Blair did 10, 15 years ago. But it needs to be, people need to understand why there is this wealth disparity. Who made money off the bat, and whose blood, sweat, and tears went into creating that money. And then we can move. When people recognize that, then we can move forward. But I think for too much of the population, people prefer being in a state of denial, and it's an uncomfortable conversation often to have, but it's just a necessary one.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that it is uncomfortable, and for some it might seem a waste of time because of how embedded, the mindset of the people who are the ones who are perpetrating the inequalities. And it brings me to another point about the media. All right, yes, the Guardian are doing their bit, but in terms of social media, do you think that social media has a part to play in changing the narrative? Um, Especially when you think that many of these social media platforms are owned by young people who have a very skewed understanding of what slavery means, in the true sense.
I think social media is up to the people who use it. I think that, the tech bros who are running these companies are not interested in equality or justice. They're just interested in making money. And they will, as we've seen with Mark Zuckerberg this year, for all the kind of pretense of believing in liberal ideals, when it came down to the bank sheet, he just ditched everything in order to stay with Donald Trump and on board in that sort of state of denial. So I think what really matters, in terms of the media in general, I think it's media institutions need to be accept this. When we launched, we knew that we were going to get sneered at and disparaged by the rest of the media. They did that, but it wasn't something that I was particularly concerned about. We knew it was going to happen, and just the fact that they actually mentioned what we were doing was, to me, an achievement. When the Sun splashed a story on its front page about something that the Guardian had uncovered about the connections between the Manchester's two massive football clubs, and the fact they're using an emblem of slavery in their club badges. That was something. It was a conversation. They obviously didn't like to hear it, but the fact that information is now out there is part of the process of gaining greater public understanding. But I think change will come from it's that kind of axis, media and politics, and well, if the media start covering it in a different way and start having voices and having debates about this issue, then the politicians can move towards that. The politicians, there's a number of brave Labour Party, mainly Labour Party backbenchers who have been putting this on the agenda and working, people like Bel Ribeiro, Adi, probably most prominent among them, who are working to have put this on the political agenda. The party hierarchy, Labour Party hierarchy, is at the moment not interested in that, but this is a slow process. We are on a journey, and I'm just hopeful that in the longer term, as people hear more, you can't ignore history. It's once you hear it, you can't unhear it. It's knowledge that's out there. We are arguing with truth, with facts. They're undeniable. And so when people become more aware of that, then I would hope that change can start to happen.
Interesting. I'm thinking now of the future in terms of what we can realistically hope for. I'm sure when you created the Legacies of Enslavement, you had a vision of what change you may have been able to enact in the United Kingdom, or globally for that matter. So what does a successful effort look like for you in, let's say, 20 years?
Well, there are lots of different aspects to the program that we've put in place. Some of it will be covering regions which have been underreported, covering communities which have been underreported. Having the fact that we are now the only British media organisation with a Caribbean correspondent. I mean, it's a shocking fact but I didn't realise there were no media organisations with a Caribbean correspondent. Now we have someone there covering issues, covering local issues. That includes covering the reparations movement. We're covering the descendant communities in Georgia and South Carolina, known as the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. That's the people who were kind of first shipped there and still very much remain in that part of the United States, covering their issues for land, for survival, for property rights. And covering these kind of issues. We've got a correspondent in South America. Again, Brazil has a black population of over 100 million people. It's second to only Nigeria in being having the biggest black population in the world. Yet when do we ever hear about Brazil's black population? Even within Brazil, the black population is barely covered. So we've now got a correspondent in Brazil covering those issues, and again, raising those stories, which we are already getting a flavor of, how that can start to change things by holding people to account, giving people a voice, giving people support. That's the power of what media can do, and excellent reporting, which The Guardian is able to do. So there's those sort of slow burn, subtle issues, but I think just the idea that it's a 10-year program, which again I was insistent on because I wanted it to be significant, meaningful, and long lasting. I didn't want it to be a short-term thing where it disappears and then you've barely noticed it. I wanted it to be a 10-year program so that the changes that we make can be embedded into the Guardian's thinking, and to see progress with working with descendant communities around the world. So so I'd like to see change in those areas where we're focusing the direct restorative justice work. I'd like to see us working, well, we already are working, but with other people in the same space, institutions. University of Manchester, for example, has a very similar history to the Guardians. We'd like to work with them and do more to sort of engage the public on this story, and other institutions. So if people, someone early on said they'd like to see Britain think about remember slavery in the same way it remembers the Holocaust. We think about Holocaust Remembrance Day, we think about the buy-in from senior politicians across the country, and it's almost a national day of recognition, which is absolutely right. But slavery just gets forgotten about. And even though Britain has far more blood on its hands over its connections to slavery, we'd like to see slavery remembered with the same sense of atonement, same sense of national reconciliation, and the need to do something to atone for it. We'd like to see that become, by the end of our time. I don't know whether it's achievable or not, but it's certainly an aim that I'd like to see. I'd like to see that change happening in Britain in the next few years. And it's not a pipe dream. I remember, getting very early press releases when I was a journalist about Holocaust Memorial Day, when no one had really heard of it at all, and it's a thing that grew and grew. And I'd like to see that happen to, a day for us to remember the transatlantic slavery in this country, and Britain's role and the wealth that it created for Britain, and that British people still enjoy. And I'd like to feel that Britain feels it needs to do something to make up for that.
Fantastic. I am cognizant of the fact that you did indicate that you have to leave at 12:30. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I've got maybe 5 minutes, but yeah.
Fantastic. So I won't hog the questions anymore. I'll open the floor for their questions. Anyone has any questions for Joseph?
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody.
Good afternoon.
I've been listening with great interest, and I wholeheartedly support the move and what you're trying to achieve, and I hope we can get there quicker. What I think is times are changing, but we're allowing the time for change to be dictated by others. I think we need to move the fight towards the people who are making change, because, as you know, with repatriations, they will take as long as they need to, and they'll slow things down, and eventually someone will say, okay, let's do this. But I think we've been for so long allowing other people to dictate the speed in which we are allowed to progress. That's my first kind of comment. My second kind of comment is I wholeheartedly agree that we do need to be celebrating the abolishment of slavery in the same way that the Second World War or ending of wars are celebrated. And I do think that's something that will bring to the attention what's exactly happened. Because, as I say previously, I think there's a lot of young people who aren't necessarily interested, but they just don't know what really happened. And I think we need to have something that brings it back every year, rather than just have like the Black History Month, which during the Black History Month I get invited to talk so many times, but during the rest of the year I can't get a look at these same people. So I think we need something for ourselves that highlights what's gone on in slavery, and for people not to forget, but also educate them, inform them what slavery actually was, and what it meant. So I'm from a family from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and a lot of people there don't even want to associate themselves as being ex-slaves or from slaves. And I think we need to kind of re-educate our own people as well as educating the wider audience. And just finally, a question: what do you see as the picture you want to paint looking like in 10 years' time?
Maybe just on the first point you made about who should be leading this or who should be driving this. I think it's about partnerships, and I think it's, I'm obviously a Black person. I work for a sort of very powerful white institution, but it's, powerful white institutions can get things done which I, as a Black person, or we in the Black community ourselves, might not be able to do on our own. And I think that the working with, whether it's universities, the Church of England, obviously John represents another strand of this, the heirs of enslavers. But I think we can all, John and his organization can again connect with people who we at the Guardian might not even be able to connect with. And so I think it's just, we need to have a lot of people in this space all working in partnership with each other in order to achieve real change. And as I say, in terms of long term, I'd like to see some of the journalists who've come through the opportunities that have been created at the Guardian. I'd like to see the Gullah Geechee communities of Southeast United States. I'd like to see them empowered and having much more control over their land and their property.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see the reparations movement, which is being, which has a lot of leadership in the Caribbean. I'd like to see that gain traction and gain ground, both in the Caribbean and in the UK and in the United States. I'd like to see those kind of that kind of movement. I'd like to see the people in Manchester. It's a kind of weird thing that where you can go to Manchester and people are aware of the cotton, but they're not aware of what the cotton means and where the cotton came from. They have no real knowledge about how the cotton was produced.
Mm-hmm.
And you go to the southern United States, and there they know very much that cotton is about slavery. They know very much that it's all about and how it was produced, but they don't know that it went where it went to. They don't realize that the cotton that they produced literally created the city of Manchester. Manchester as a city didn't exist when they started producing cotton. So there's making those transatlantic links, those global connections with Africa as well. That's what I'd like to see, and a kind of a growth of sort of global consciousness about this, so that it's not seen as a fringe thing or something we don't like to talk about, that Britain as a nation starts to own up and accept its history and do something about it.
Great, thank you.
Fantastic. I don't know if you have one more question that you will allow, but I do have a curious question, and it has to do with our friend across the pond, who is effectively getting rid of the diversity, the DEI programs across the United States government. And you know what they say, when the US has a cold, we sneeze. Do you think that there is a possibility that we in Britain may somehow import some of those policies?
Oh, there's definitely a possibility, but I think we just need to stand firm. And I think it's something what I don't want is that people just assume that everything's going against us and therefore we just kind of lie down and just accept our fate. I think we had to fight it all the way. I think we We need to make the case for diversity, for inclusion. We need to make the case for reparations and restorative justice. And so, it's a fight. We never achieve anything without a fight. And on the path, there are ups and downs. But, even in the United States, people are fighting back. He's not having it his own way. Court judgments are going against him. People are protesting against him, even within institutions where they've said that they appear to have rolled back on diversity and inclusion. There are still people like us in those institutions who are still making sure that that work goes ahead. They may not be shouting about it in the way that they and publicly declaring it in the way they were, but they're still going ahead. They know it's good. They know it's the right thing to do. They know it's fair. They know it's just. They know that we need to be all our institutions need to be more represented. So, more representative. So, I think it's a fight that's an ongoing fight. It's just part of the struggle that nothing goes in a straight line. Progress is always up and down. But we just need to know where we're heading, and we need to sort of have that faith in ourselves that we can get there.
Yeah, I agree. And I only hope that our politicians and our leaders have the will to do it. Michelle, do you want to jump in quickly before
I am going to have to go
you
now.
have to leave now?
But,
All right,
thanks
fantastic.
very much for inviting me. It's been great to be part of this.
It's been great, and we look forward to seeing you on the 25th at the House of Lords.
Okay, hopefully. Yeah,
Right.
see you then.
Thank you, Joseph.
Bye.
Bye. Great. So, Michelle, you want to give us your view on what Joseph had shared with us?
Well, I don't have in that instance. I think it might have been Derek, if I'm seeing the name correctly. I don't know the last name. Was pointing out, I believe, and I hope I heard you correctly, about continuity, if you will. We have Black History Month, we have, lots of significant events, etc. But then as the year progresses, where do we find those same kind of people and same kind of conversation? If that's what you were alluding to, Derek, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is why ACSIS and ACSIS, these exchange webinars, etc., we are looking to fill some of those gaps by bringing these conversations on a more continuous basis, so that people have a platform that they can, ask questions, they can make suggestions, they can comment, and they can find some of those people that are very prominent, let's put it that way, during the Black History Month. So I think that's, as we focus in there, because even for myself, sometimes I will be quite candid with you. I've said, well, why do we have all of this? You've got all the rah-rah happening, and then it seemed to just die away, right? So I get it. But again, this is the reason why we have these conversations, because we want to make sure that it just doesn't die away, that we continue, and that we keep it at the forefront of people's mind, because it's such an important topic. So that's all.
Fantastic. Derek, you want to respond to that?
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I totally agree. That's what I was alluding to. Is keep it in the forefront, not just this Black History Month and then everything's forgotten about. We need a kind of continual presence, but at the same time, I'm conscious we don't need to keep ramming stuff down people's throats. But there needs to be that presence of, well, this did happen, it did go on. Yes, it is uncomfortable. You're not going to talk about it, but there are ways we can go around it to keep it in everyone's mind throughout the year, not just on a month or a couple of days.
Yeah, that is completely true, because I within the media, I realize that I get a lot of information about, activities pertaining to the African Caribbean community only at a certain time of the year. And for someone who has spent most of my life in the media dealing with African and Caribbean topics and issues, it seems totally insufficient, especially as there are things impacting the lives of Africans and Caribbeans in the UK on a daily basis. So why would you reserve, 4 weeks in the year to do this? I think there's the equivalent of, is it Juneteenth in the United States, where there's a similar effort to recognize the African experience? Does anyone know?
Yes, I am aware of Juneteenth.
Juneteenth, yes. Yeah, I think they do something similar. So I think Joseph is right. We need to somehow find programs that can get us to be thinking more holistically about what impacts us on a regular basis rather than reserving it to 4 weeks in the year. So does anyone have any questions for Michelle or Derek before we get back to John Dower? Now is the time. All right, fantastic. John, I have to apologize for interrupting your flow when you started at the beginning of the session.
No problem.
But if you don't mind, if you can just summarize what you had said in the beginning and then carry on to finish, and I have some questions for you.
Yeah, I think basically I was just introducing myself and giving you an impression as to why I felt that our family had to apologize and do something. We made our apology in early 2023, and ever since then I have been involving myself in the reparative justice campaign as much as I can, and that really, I think, the main work I've been doing, apart from the Trevelyan family setting up a charity in Grenada. Well, it's set up here, but it's explicitly for funding education projects in Grenada, because that's what the family kind of voted as a majority that they wanted to put money into. So we're funding 2 projects in Grenada at the moment. One, a primary school project called Grenade, and the other, we're looking at the University of the West Indies, the Open Campus project, where we're trying to help fund people for whom it's very difficult to be able to fund their university courses, because it means traveling all over the islands of the Caribbean, because the University of the West Indies is obviously quite split and spread amongst the islands. So we're doing that, and then the other work I'm doing is with Heirs of Slavery, which I can talk more about. But just that's just a sort of an introduction as to where I've come from, why it started, and the sort of the overall organizations that I'm now involved with.
Okay. Well, that is good to know. And I need to thank you again for taking the time to sit with us today. I'm looking at responsibility and reparation. So how do you see the role of descendants of enslavers today in the reparations restorative justice movements?
I think they're essential. I mean, oh, where do you start? The wound is so big. The trauma caused is so huge. The crimes against humanity are so massive. And like Joseph very succinctly said, in Germany, they did this. Reparative justice was a reality in Germany after the Second World War. I suspect that part of the reason for that was there was a world uprising, and as we know, the United Nations was formed, and the Nuremberg trials, came into being, and there was a real sense that reparative justice was essential to do at that point. Now, at no point has there been a major apology or any kind of real substance to reparative justice made around transatlantic chattel enslavement, and around the trade, and around all of the benefits that have been accrued by the British government, but also over Europe. I mean, we know there are lots and lots of countries involved in Europe, so it's a huge subject. And I think Joseph quite also eloquently said his grandmother, someone of the age of his grandmother, who was born in early last century, they will still have remembered people who were enslaved. And we heard those stories in Grenada. So actually the history is within touching distance. It's within memory distance anyway. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I think the descendants of the enslavers have got masses to do here. We are trying to encourage them to come forward. It's not always an easy journey for people, and it's not always an easy journey for us to persuade them. But that's the journey that has to happen. But I do want to say that ultimately, though I think the responsibility is with descendants of the enslavers to come forward, we need to be led. And, we as Heirs of Slavery, we're a tiny organization. We need to be led by government. We need to be led by leaders. That's why the Church of England apology is, I think, significant and important. And we are calling for, one of the things that we're doing with Heirs of Slavery is to call to the government to make inroads into reparative justice. As Joseph said, Tony Blair said something like, "We regret," or "We are sorry for." That's not enough. We have to be pushing the government to get involved in reparative justice. Now, in October of last year, Keir Starmer explicitly said that he was not going to get involved in talk about apologies or reparations. This was at the CHOGM conference, the conference, the Commonwealth Leaders Conference, which definitely took the wind out of our sails, because that was a kind of explicit moment. We'd heard Rishi Sunak say the same thing when asked by Belle Ribeiro Addy in Parliament whether they were going to apologise, and he said no. When Keir Starmer said no in October, given the fact we've got a Black Caribbean Minister for Foreign Affairs, we really hoped that Labour were going to be a different beast, but they've turned out not to be. We also are pretty confident that the King is on our side. We know that he's got a black goddaughter. We know that he's gone to the Caribbean and made quite explicit declarations of regret. I suspect that he's probably more on our side than we think, but he's obviously, his hands are tied by the government. I mean, the important thing I think for us to recognise is that the King is essentially, he's a very grand puppet, but he is basically a puppet of the government. He's doing what the government bids him to do. We need leadership, and I think that's what we must be lobbying for. And I think that's why the movement has to grow, and we have to be trying to put pressure on our leaders to make the grown-up decisions they need to make, which is to get involved in reparative justice.
So do you think essentially that the government's participation is something that is necessary in terms of you meeting your mandate, or is there a chance that you could independently get to where you want to without them?
I don't think we'll stop. I mean, I see this as a long-term mission for myself, and I think many of us do think that. I'm very aware, for example, that in 10 years' time, or no, now 8 years' time, it's going to be the 200 years bicentenary of the abolition of Slavery Act of 1833. That's a really important date, and we need to mark it, and we need to also make sure that that date is not seen as a glorification of the abolitionists. I mean, in 2007, the bicentenary of the abolition of the actual trade itself, William Wilberforce was held up as a hero. There were all sorts of films were made about him. Wasn't he this wonderful man? And I know that many members of the reparations campaigning community called it a Wilbur farce for good reason, because we do not need that. What we need to do is have a reckoning. My main mission is, I think, in education, because I think the reason we are where we are, and the reason why so many people are in denial, is because they don't know their history. They don't recognize that, Britain's colonial power came from extraction, exploitation, enslavement, humiliation, subjugation. They just don't understand it. They think that Britain has this God-given right to be this great country. I think many European countries are similar, particularly countries like Portugal, where it's even more difficult, I think, and France, actually. I'm also having interesting conversations with reparations campaigners in France. So we need to keep moving forward in education, I think, and I think education is key here, because if we can get the genocide of African people as part of the transatlantic trade recognized and embedded in the curriculum, we will start to realize that the wound created and the crime committed is of the same kind of level. I don't want to start making comparisons, really, but we know that the Holocaust was appalling and it was a terrible crime, but I would say that the crime that was committed against African people through transatlantic trade has got many similarities and links. And until the moment when British people recognize that, I think we are not going to fully appreciate what we have to do to make amends.
What would you say to people of my and your generation who look at the whole issue of slavery as being something that should remain in the past? I'm speaking more particularly about Black people who just can't be bothered. What would you say to them in terms of your efforts, given, of course, your legacy, and what it is you're trying to achieve?
Well, are you talking specifically about people of our generation, David, as in?
Yes, the
Yeah.
baby boomers.
It's difficult for people who of our age because, in a way, we're on the. I suppose, you know, I'm relatively close to retirement, so I think people of our age tend to think I've sort of done my bit. I now need to sort of start thinking about my slow decline towards, you know, the grave, which I suppose is. I'm sorry, I'm just being very explicit and candid about
Graphic.
the reality, but yes, I mean, I really believe that we have to be thinking about the future, that we owe it to the young people, to our children, to our grandchildren, to be thinking about what the world will be like for them. I think it's, I hate to say it, I sort of think it's a selfish view to think that we can just, you know, say, what's the point of talking about the past? We have to think about the future. I have a lot of my relatives who said the same thing to me when I told them about the reality of our family's involvement in plantation ownership, and I said to them, look, racism is alive and well. You know, I live in Brixton, I see it every day. I can see the disparities of economic you know, economy, of work, of mental health, of house ownership, of opportunities. I can see it. Really what you're saying then is we don't want to do anything about the future, you know, trying to create a more equal world. I suppose that's what I would say to them. I mean, I feel very passionately, as you can tell, that we really need to do something about the future now.
Yeah, and that it's refreshing to hear you say that, you know, that you live in Brixton. I mean, Brixton has been historically known for being, you know, quite how would you put it, more culturally aligned to African Caribbean people. And then to say that you, somebody of Caucasian descent, consider you can see racism, why then is it so difficult for people who represent, you know, your group to not see it or to pretend it doesn't exist?
Yeah, that's a good question.
You know, how
I mean,
could they do that?
look, I'm going to be really candid here. I was brought up in Devon. Okay. I was brought up in Devon in the 1960s and 70s. Devon in the 1960s and 70s, probably not dissimilar to now. 99.9% white. We told racist jokes about the Irish, about black people, about Jews. We didn't know any better. You know, I was brought up in a racist society. So I think what I am is a work in progress, trying to get over my bigotry that was ingrained in me by the society when I was a child. I think that for many white people, they are still works in progress, if I'm really frank. And so I think one of the things that this journey has taught me is that I'm trying to see things from the perspective of people who, you know, from other people. And one of the things that has been amazing about my experience of reparative justice is I've walked into rooms full of black people who I can feel the resentment in the air. I can feel it. And I understand it now in a way that I didn't. I think that there is a great misunderstanding from many white people who kind of think that racism's been solved because the laws changed and the Equalities Act, and we're now seeing more black people in commercials and there's more black footballers. I mean, I think it's nonsense. I think that racism is alive and well, and I think you'd agree with me that that's what I hear from people of African descent. That's what they tell me. But I don't think there's a lot of white people who I think are in denial. And might I add that another thing that I think is really important in this conversation to recognize, and this is a difficult one, and it's probably at the nub of the problem, is that many, and I think we've discussed this ourselves, David, is I think that white people who are descended from the privilege that they've gained through colonialism in whatever form, you know, whether their families made money from, you know, many generations ago from plantation ownership, whether they made money by being descended from people who made cloth that was then used to buy people in the west of Africa, which is what happened. whether they made money as a family from making, you know, ironmongery to enslave, you know, to use with the enslaved. There are so many people in this country who have benefited from indirectly or directly from transatlantic trade. And I think it's very hard for them to understand that privilege and social capital and the benefits that are being derived from coming from such a well-off and well-resourced country. And it's been well-resourced and and rich for a large part of it because of the extraction and exploitation of others. They find it really hard to accept that maybe that privilege comes from that wound that was caused many years ago. They find that hard because what they have to realize then is, oh, I'm not maybe as smart, clever as I thought I was. Maybe I've got here because I've got blue eyes and I've got an English sounding name and I've been educated at, you know, a good university or a school because that's what my parents expected of me, which is all about privilege. So privilege isn't just about money, it's about social capital, it's about connections, it's about, you know, expectations of you, it's about the environment in which you're brought up. So it's a long answer to a simple question, but I think that at root, that's why white people find it hard to accept, because ultimately it means that they've got to accept the fact that they are where they are because of the color of their skin and their ancestry.
That's right. And when you think in terms of the amount of participants, 46,000 families had owned slaves.
Well, it was 46,000 claims, of which there were less families, but anyway, let's not quibble. It was thousands of families.
Yeah, thousands.
Yeah.
You know, when you think about that, when you think of how they're spread across the island of Great Britain, it's enormous. And you could understand why that mindset exists today, because that privilege transferred over time.
Yeah.
But look, let's not belabor that. We can discuss this more at the House of Lords on the 25th when you come down there, and we'll have a structured argument or structured discussion about, you know, this whole phenomenon. So look, I'll stop there for now to let the floor ask some questions, because I'm sure there are quite a few burning questions that our audience have.
Well, one thing I would like to say, though, before we do that, is that I very much value the fact that you are an alignment of Africa and the Caribbean, because to me that feels essential. We need to start aligning these big blocks which have not been properly aligned for a long time. So the triangular trade went between, as we know, West of Africa. Obviously people were brought from all over Africa, but mainly that side, Caribbean and the North and the Americas and Latin America and Europe. And to me, the future of this conversation is going to be strengthened if we can create those alignments. So I applaud you for bringing the Africa and Caribbean together with this organization. That's why I thought it was so important to talk at the Reparative Justice conference that you're holding. So I think that's really, really important. And I'm involved with a Reparative Justice campaigning group in Nantes in France, who are currently trying to bring together ports that were involved in the trade. So we're talking about, you know, all the ports in Britain, Portugal, France, Germany, Sweden, Holland, Netherlands, the Caribbean, Latin America, North America. This is a really important conversation, and I think and union. And I think as we start to gather more allies and relationships, we can start to make a difference. But I think it's only going to work if organizations like yours, which I applaud, are absolutely at the center of those conversations. So thank you for the invitation, and I applaud what you're doing.
Thank you very much, John. That is very good to hear. So I will open the floor to questions. Anyone, just shoot from the hip if you need to, but of course, remember, we're having a friendly conversation here.
Okay, while people are warming up, then I guess I'll have another go. It's mainly some some observations more than direct questions. I'm just in agreement with John. I think education is really fundamental to all this, and really is the key. People need to be educated, whether they want to hear it or not. But also, there needs to be a kind of almost a line drawn of we need to find out what we actually want. We talk about privilege, and how are we defining privilege? Are we defining it because what happened a couple of generations ago? Because I can give the same kind of argument with some of the people I know, where they've gone into a bank with a gun, stole a lot of money, and then their children have then benefited thereafter, whether it be education, etc. So we need to kind of identify what we really want to achieve when we say, right, we want what do we want from people? Do we want to punish people? Do we want to say, look, this is what happened generations ago, you should be doing X, Y, Z now? We really need to define what we want and what the end game is, what we want to achieve, what our objectives are. And I think to get that, we do need some sort of organization that does lead on the main points. We also need, as with the poppies, we need an emblem to say this is about racism, this is about historical slavery, all that encapsulates all in one. But I think we need to kind of really identify what we're trying to achieve with all the various groups, various talks, various topics. It needs to be kind of one, in my mind, it seems to be one journey, one route that's going to give us the answers at the end of the day. Because otherwise we leave ourselves open to a lot of interpretation and let others kind of say what they think we're trying to achieve. Sorry if I seem a little bit all over the place. I'm getting quite passionate about this, but I just think there needs to be overall our direction in where we're going and what we want to achieve at the end of the day. And I think
Derek,
simple is a huge key.
Derek,
Sorry,
that's
John.
a really interesting point. But the way I would answer that is to say, in my experience, which is limited, I agree. I understand that. I've only been doing this for a few years, and there are people who've been doing this for much longer than me. One of the things that struck me is how disparate this conversation has been. So, for example, if you go back to the Durban conference of early 90s, at that point, the African Union and CARICOM could not really agree on a common way of approaching reparative justice. So CARICOM went on its own way and made up the 10-point plan, which they're currently in the middle of revamping. The African Union is quite late to this conversation in some ways. It's really great that they've called 2025 the year for reparatory justice. I think that's really positive, and it's brilliant that an organisation such as yours, David, has come into formation. But the question I would have would be, where is that leadership coming, which has authority to talk to big governments as a unified bloc? And I think if we can join together, and I like your idea of an emblem, by the way. I think if there was an emblem of reparative justice which was kind of worldwide, then we'd really be putting pressure on governments. But I still feel we're too disparate at the moment. I mean, maybe you, David, you've got a sense of how that might coalesce and how there might become a organization that could come into being, which could kind of have that gravity and authority. Is it the UN? Definitely. I mean, I've done panels with UNESCO, but UNESCO feels like a little bit of a talking shop to me. I've been on a couple of panels with them talking about racism and reparative justice, and it feels like everyone agrees, but nothing's done.
There's no will. There's no will to do it.
Yeah.
There's no will, but I too like the idea of the emblem, because what we're trying to do, as I mentioned to you, in terms of the focus of the World Reparations Conference at the House of Lords on the 25th, is to get a coalition, if you will, of the different, as you call them, disparate groups around the globe to sort of think about and maybe enact a unified approach to dealing with reparations and reparative justice. But there needs to be symbolism. I'm all for. I've come from that marketing journalistic background where everything has to be represented by a symbol of some sort. And maybe this could be something that we table for discussion at that launch, or maybe it might be put on the agenda for the actual conference in 2026. But Derek, I need to thank you for providing that suggestion, because I'm sure John and I will be discussing it again later on this month.
Yeah.
Okay, remember where you heard it first.
Derek, I also wanted to say, by the way, I heard you came from St. Vincent. I was just speaking to this morning to another heir of the enslavers who has gone to St. Vincent early this year and went to the plantation, which was called the school is called Diamond. The village is called Diamonds.
Diamonds, yeah.
And that's a plantation, an ex-plantation that his family owned, which he'd only discovered a couple of years ago, and he's setting up a school in Brighton and Hove with that village school. He's setting up a partnership, a twinning,
yeah.
Which I think, these are small things, but to me, apology is really important. It was funny when you used the word unapologetic at the beginning, David, because I was thinking, actually, I think from my perspective, apology is where it has to begin, because I think until there is a sense of a heartfelt apology coming from descendants of people who made money and derived privilege and benefit, then nothing can begin. I think for me, apology was where it began for the Trevelyan family, and I think, and I'm proud is maybe the wrong word, but I'm so pleased that this man, this is a guy called James Christie Miller. He'll be on the panel at the conference with me, and he'll tell us a little bit about his journey, and about what he thinks this twinning might do. I just wanted to say anyway, Derek, that I'm really mindful of the wound that was caused on your island and Grenada, and what we're trying to do about it.
Just just briefly, it's wonderful that's been recognised. That's really so pleasing to hear. But it's the small things that will together. I know it's cliche, but small things together that will make that change.
Yeah.
And if we have lots of little projects where they're doing the same thing, not everyone doing different things, but a few people doing the same thing, then that little small thing to turn into a big something. So really, really appreciate what you and your friends are doing.
Thank you.
Right.
So John, okay, go ahead, Michelle.
If I may, there are two things that I wanted to I latched onto. I think it's John that you mentioned it. You talked about education, and you talk about apology, and you said there must, apology must come, and I agree with you. I do think, however, before that could actually happen, the education part is paramount. I think that I can walk in the shoes of myself as an African woman or a woman of African descent. I can't necessarily walk in the shoes of a person of Caucasian descent, but what I can, what I definitely can recognize is that there are quite a few instances when I talk to people that are Caucasian that they don't necessarily understand the true ramification of what happens. Like I said, I can't walk in the shoes. I don't know whether that's it's authentic. I take it as authentic. I'm skipping over my words. So I think the education part is quite important, because the education is what's going to drive the apology. The education is what's going to drive the recognition that the apology is not just someone trying to force an apology out of someone, but you understand from education why that apology is necessary. So that's one point that I wanted to make. So this just a bit of a comment, and feel free to comment on it once I'm done. That's quite okay. But I do have a question that I kind of put together here that says, how can reparation address the intergenerational trauma, loss of language and cultural displacement, etc., beyond financial? I know that when we talk reparative justice, a lot of times people are talking financial, but let's dial it back a bit and look at myself, for example. I want to be able to go and search for something that gives me a good historical background of my ancestors, but there is not a lot. there is not things that I can go to necessarily and explore. There are some documentary, and yes, I can go through those documentary, etc. But there is such a big gap. There's such a big loss of information. I think part of reparative justice should really focus on how to help us get back some of that lost information, and in particular, the generational trauma. Because of course, being a person who looks after, I look at things, everything from a life coaching perspective. I want to know, how does it help? I know there's going to be financial necessary to help with that, but I am talking beyond that scope. What do you see are things that could be done? And maybe there are conversations already been had and I'm just not privy to it. But if you could just shed some light there, would be fantastic.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the CARICOM 10-point plan, I think, is a really important document, and it's the first point is apology, but certainly discussing the trauma that was caused is part of the plan that have to be redressed. Of course, it's a really, really difficult subject. But in terms of research and that kind of thing, I know that the UCL Legacies of Slavery database, which I think is a seismic piece of work, and when it came out in 2014, I think it was a game changer, because it meant that families like mine could go online and research their background, and it was there in black and white. But of course, that's great for the descendants of enslavers, because that was relatively easy to digitize. Much more difficult to digitize are the names of the enslaved people, are the family trees of the enslaved people. And I know that the UCL Legacies of Slavery database is now addressing that and trying to find those things. And I know there are lots of databases and Facebook groups and all sorts on the internet where people are now trying to help each other find their families from different islands. So I think that's really important. And I think archival maintenance, saving archives. Let's face it, in the Caribbean now, there are lots of archives that are under threat because of hurricanes, damaged buildings. The Grenadian National Archive has been closed for years because they don't have a safe building, and all of that disintegrating paperwork needs to be digitized so that people can go to it and find out these things. So Michelle, I'm totally in agreement with you. I think we are pushing. I know that my cousin Laura, who's based in New York, Laura Trevelyan, is involved in conversations around saving archives and digitizing archives, and it's something that we talk about quite a lot. And I know that CARICOM are also very interested in it. So I understand that it's a small token in terms of the trauma and the wound that was caused, but I think there are people who are really thinking about these things.
Interesting. Right. Well, thank you, Michelle, for bringing that in, because you're quite right. Education is the key to changing attitudes and changing behavior. But one of the things that I'm thinking of in terms of why it is the descendants of the enslavers, or many of them, might be reluctant to want to join your group, John, is because most people don't like to feel vulnerable. And vulnerability is, in my view, the precursor to giving an apology of any kind. You have to allow yourself to get to that place where you are giving of yourself in that situation. And if you are privileged, I think you're less likely to want to succumb to that. I don't know what your views are on that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's really well observed. Let's go to the most extreme example of Descendants of the Enslavers, James Drax, of which a book has been written by Paul Lashmar, journalist Paul Lashmar. And I don't know if you know about James Drax. He still owns
Barbados.
All on Barbados. He's one of the richest. He's now an ex-MP, but he was one of the richest MPs in the country. He owns something. He's worth something like 150 million. He's got a huge estate in Dorset, most of which was derived. The riches from his estate was derived from a guy. I'm just reading the book at the moment. His very, very early ancestor, James Drax, was in Barbados right at the beginning of its formation as a sugar, dominion, where it became a huge producer of sugar, and huge riches were gained. if you think about someone like him, he has so much to lose and he has gained so much that persuading him to join the conversation is virtually impossible. It's even impossible for us to reach him. I mean, for example, it was interesting that Joseph said we can reach people that the Guardian can't. Well, actually, it's pretty hard for us to reach those kind of establishment figures because they won't talk to us because they think of us as kind of, I wouldn't say revolutionaries, but they think of us as kind of troublemakers or you know, whatever they want to call us, you know, upstarts or woke. The we're too woke, you know. You know, there's a lot of people who think that we're woke, too liberal, you know, white guilt, all those kind of things. It's very hard for us to reach people like that. But if I think about the majority of relatively well-off white people, they feel guilty and they feel shame and they feel scared. And they also feel like they have something to lose. And then at root of it, right at the sort of root, I would say, on a subconscious level, maybe, is that notion that maybe they'll have to uncover something which will make them feel less good about themselves, which is what I was talking about earlier. So I think there are many reasons, but I think at root, there is this problem that we're sort of unearthing a sense of maybe I haven't really earned what I've got, which I definitely have. You know, I've definitely been humbled by this process and I'm explicit about it. So I think there are many people who have still got to go through that journey, which is why probably when you talked earlier on about people of our age, David, it may well be that people of our age, that there isn't much hope. We have to get the young people on board.
Yeah.
To get it into education, and we have to change things from the ground up. I know that that's probably very painful to hear because that requires many years of work and waiting for those changes. But I think it's going to be very hard to persuade. We know how conservative with a small c and a big C this nation is at heart. That's why Margaret Thatcher was voted back 3 times in a row, you know, or is it 4 times? You know, we are, I think, we do love tradition. We do love, you know, that's why the royal family is still so popular. How do we change that notion of what Britain has about itself? That's at root the question, I think.
I just quickly interject. With the case of the Drax family, for instance, it kind of comes back to my point earlier when I kind of say, well, what do we want? What are we looking to achieve? Because if they knew that we weren't just coming after them to take all their money and leave them without anything from what their legacy is, has given to them, they might be a bit more forthcoming if they actually knew what we wanted from them. If it was just an apology, or if it was financial, or if it was this or it is that. I think again, because and as far as I'm not privy to a lot of conversations, as Misha mentioned earlier. So I don't know if these kind of conversations already been had, but what is it that we want from the people in privilege? What do they want, and what they're so frightened of having the conversations for? If they knew what we wanted at the end of the day, maybe they would feel more like talking about the whole situations.
Yeah, well, you need a unified voice, I think. I mean, if you look in terms of social change, I mean, the women got the vote. You know, people who weren't rich got the vote. There was an Equalities Act. These things didn't come about by government just being nice. They came about through, you know, rebellion, campaigning, demonstrations. And I think if we can create a unified voice, which is what I was talking about earlier on, and we can go and canvass the government and go and demonstrate with a unified emblem behind us, even, Derek, as you suggested, then I think we can start to become a body of trying to movement for change, which actually is irresistible. But right now, Drax hears so many people who are absolutely, you know, are out for blood and out to get his estates off him, as well as the reasonable voices talking about it on an ethical or on a you know, on a moral basis. He's sort of able to just ignore it. When that movement became big enough and coherent enough and legitimate enough, then things will start to change, which is my fervent hope.
I agree.
Yeah, that movement would have to be undeniable.
Yeah.
You know, you Steve?
David, yeah. Just a couple of odd things following up on reparation, reparative justice. I think it's critical that we as a population begin to get some clarity, and that's happening. So, for example, St. Vincent and Grenadines has just completed a major piece of work on the history of St. Vincent. And absolutely insightful. From the introduction that was held at UE a couple of weeks ago, the island was the last of the Caribbean and had a short span of the slave trade. The strength was around its indigenous population, the Caribs and the Arawaks. And it's a variance of the history that we were taught at those elusive schools across the Caribbean. So that change is going to happen. So there are a number of these different info. And for example, reimbursement of plantation owners continued up to the 21st century, which means that we as taxpayers were making that contribution. In addition, we are now at a stage where people begin to ask who they are. So across the entire Caribbean, there are genealogy groups who are looking at those archives that John referred to. And I've been involved in it for some time. And it's reaping a lot of benefit. People beginning to understand where they came from, who they are. And it's much more complex. And then the other factor is why the resistance by government to accept? Is it a liability issue and the impact of that on government and major industries? My position.
Thank you, Steve.
I got a couple of things to say, Steve. The reimbursement happened in 1834, and the when you refer to it continuing, that was the loan that the government took out with Rothschild Bank to the tune of something like 20 million. That was being repaid by taxpayers. So my family 6 generations ago received £29,000 shared between 3 families who owned the plantations in Grenada. But that was 6 generations ago. So there hasn't been money coming in since then. Just to I mean, I'm fully aware that they still owned the plantations. There was still income coming in afterwards. But I suppose I'm just trying to point out that it wasn't continuing to all families. Anyway, sorry, I'm not trying to quibble. It was just a point of fact. But the answer as to you asked about the resistance from governments. What have they got to lose? The thing with apology is, as I understand it from when I talk to legal minds, they say that if you apologize for something, it means you are liable. Mm-hmm. It's sort of on a legal basis. And I would say that the reason the government are reluctant to admit liability, which is what they would do by apologizing, is they would lay themselves open to financial liability. And right now, as we know, this government is in a precarious position financially. I'm not trying to excuse them. I'm just trying to think of it from their perspective. I'm imagining the conversations around the table at Rachel Reeves's house at number 11 Downing Street with the Prime Minister, and they're going, "Look, we can just about afford to keep running the NHS, but if we start to talk to CARICOM about what we should do about the terrible wound that was created by our predecessors, we're going to bankrupt the country. But not only that, we're going to also become unvotable because no one will vote for us because we've got a bitter opposition in Nigel Farage." I mean, I'm really not trying to make excuses for them. I'm just trying to think about how they're thinking. So I do think that, I think they're mistaken, because I think there can be something gained by talking about reparative justice, because I think as soon as you engage in conversation with CARICOM, what you start doing is you start to create positive relationships with Caribbean islands. You start to create an understanding between people, which I think can lead to benefit. It's really ironic. If you go to Grenada and you talk to Dickon Mitchell, the Prime Minister, I was listening to a podcast interview he did recently with Clive Lewis and Laura Trevelyan. The podcast is called Heirs of Enslavement. I highly recommend it. The last part is an interview that he gives, and he says, and David, I'm sure you're aware of this. He says, why would we go to Britain for support when the Chinese give us so much? So the Chinese have built a stadium in the island, cricket stadium. They've built houses, blocks of flats. They've started investing in roads and infrastructure. And you're thinking, Britain, why are you being so stupid? Why don't you understand that engaging and becoming involved in a positive conversation about how we can mutually make things better for us? It's not just about creating better trading circumstances, which is ultimately what seems to be Britain's aim. It's about if you support the Caribbean and make them, you know, make their economy stronger, make their infrastructure better, make their education system better, it will have benefits for everybody. And I just wish that they did, but they don't think like that, do they? And you can see that it might not be a big vote winner. They're just always mindful of that.
Yeah, they seem to be a bit myopic, but then that's another story for another time.
Yeah.
You know, they're just looking at the immediate gains and they can't see the long-term benefits. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to apologize, but we are 4 minutes out to closing. I must say this has been a rather intense and enlightening conversation, and I look forward to carrying it on even further as we approach 3 weeks from the World Reparations Conference launch at the House of Lords. So I'd like to thank my speakers. Joseph has since left us. He has made a huge contribution to the discussion, provided lots of important and interesting points that we ended up looking at in his wake. And John, you have carried the discussion. You've pretty much carried it from the beginning to the end. And we do, and I speak for all of the other attendees here, we do understand the challenge that the descendants of enslavers experience and feel every day. We also understand that it can't be easy, you know, having inherited all of that wealth and then still having to justify keeping it. You know, it's a difficult thing for us on the other side of the conversation to contemplate. So I'd like to thank you for your bravery in what you do as an ongoing challenge. And I look forward to discussing this in more detail with the church representatives, with some of the pillars within the reparations movement, people like Esther Stanford Zosi and others on the 25th. So I thank you immensely for joining us today and sharing your story. And I thank all the speakers, all who contributed. Derek, RJ, I hope this is not the first and the last time that we will encounter each other.
Thank you.
Thank Steve Mango, who has always been a source of inspiration for the many years I know him. And of course, my team, Michelle and Madison and Aaron and others. So it has been an interesting discussion on reparations, reparative justice. So what I'd like to do is to just go through one major announcement. You might have heard me speaking of it occasionally on this session. We have the ACSIS World Reparations Conference, the first of its kind, coming up on the 25th of September, in 3 weeks' time, at the House of Lords. So we're launching this discussion about reparations, reparative justice, and we're bringing together disparate groups from Ethiopia, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, the United States, and of course here in the United Kingdom. We have a very interesting lineup. So if anyone here is interested, then you can apply. It's essentially by invitation only, but we will look at what we need to do to ensure that that people are allowed in. The next webinar takes place on the 18th of August, sorry, the 18th of September, and that we will focus once again on food and food security. So once again, I thank you for your contributions and being a part of this ACSIS Exchange webinar series, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Goodbye and take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.